Well, good morning, and it's just me. So I greet you from a very cold but very sunny mountaintop in California. And I also greet you having kind of recovered from 2 weeks of absolute sickness. And I managed to put together last week's episode, but I was rather under the weather at the time, and took several days off from school last week, and I'm kind of bringing it back together after a very kind of severe sinus infection gone wrong into my eyes, and everything was horrible. But I'm back, and again, it's just me. But a lot's been going on that side, and I kind of wanted to speak to that because it's gotten a lot of reaction, the current and former series. So I wanted to make a bit of an update on kind of what I'm on about with all of this. So from that standpoint, the book was announced, right? The book. I don't quite know where I'm going to publish. I've been in contact, and I've not liked what I've heard back from publishers so far. And mainly it has to do with the timing. I want to release it soon on my schedule, not on some publisher's schedule that puts it a year away. You know, that's always been my kind of difficulty and problem with academic publishing, is that, for example, there's a piece on GLP that I released last August to a publisher, and it is yet to be published. It's been, accepted and edited and all that stuff, and I think the journal comes out next month or April or something. But there's almost a year between what I wrote and it getting out to you, and for me that's too much time. Same thing with the last 3 books that I wrote for Lived Places Publishing. There was about a year interval between, the original pitch and seeing it, physically in print. And so for this piece, the kind of field guide, as you were, I didn't want it to be, so long. I didn't want to see it like, is it, what's going on, when is it coming, and all that kind of stuff. I wanted to control that myself. So I'm still looking. It would be something like, Kindle Direct or something like that, as other people's are using, kind of, just-in-time publishing or whatever, or print on demand. These are the different terms. I want there to be an electronic version. I want there to be a hard print version. And so I'm kind of taking my time with that as I'm developing out stuff. But as I wrote about in the Gestalt kind of unmasking pieces, there's something very profound that happens when a Gestalt processor says, I want to do something. When action finally happens, a lot of stuff has gone on under the hood and under the bonnet, to say like, okay, I'm ready for this. I have the coherence to move forward. And so from that standpoint, my brain has been active. What does that mean? Creating that relational field necessary for the book to land. And indeed, the book has landed, and it's been quite overwhelming. And so the Gestalt unmasking series and the current one that we're going through on executive functioning, they needed to happen first because I needed to prepare the ground, the relational field, the language field for the book to land fully. And easily, and so those things came first, and amazingly enough, side by side over on Sensual Residue, another piece came out, which is kind of a trifecta of positions necessary to address this 5-dimensional field that I need in order to create these books. So those are done, and I'm working from that standpoint. But I thought I wanted to do some kind of clarifications. And so in today, which is Saturday, the piece on Gestalt time, I said that it grew from a persistent misunderstanding that, in my earlier essays and indeed others writing about this, from a standpoint of language, right, that, that perhaps GLP, because of, the previous academic work over on the speech side, with Present and Marge Blanc talking about, language therapies and language pathologies, that it was kind of an aspect of autism, that it was a clever kind of dialect, a trick or whatever of borrowed phrases and stuff. It was quirky autism. And I've seen a bit of that in self-advocacy and in coaching spaces where, hey, do you do this, with ukulele and stuff? Well, then you could be autistic. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit in today's article, that Gestalt processing is larger than language. It's larger than any single diagnosis, and it's a way of meeting the world before the world has learned to introduce itself. And I know when I say things to analytic processors, to people who are not themselves autistic, they think I sound funny, and not from accent wise, but just the way that I phrase things. And so I wanted to be kind of clear in today's article. And then I'm also working on a transition piece for after, kind of explaining this in more kind of academic voice, if you will, less poetry and more kind of matter-of-fact record keeping and stuff. But I do want to kind of hammer the point home. Many autistic people, like myself, are Gestalt processors. This is true. Many, but not all. Not all. And many who are not autistic, not even in the hidden, undiagnosed, I haven't found myself since, are Gestalt processors as well, right? And there are autistics who are analytic processors. And so, I wanted to make sure that people understood this, that I wasn't claiming something that I haven't claimed, right? That I have kind of firmly stated the thesis, and I think I have throughout books and articles and so on, that I've never claimed that Gestalt processing and autism are synonymous, or that one requires the other, right? So I wanted to kind of begin with that in today's article. And it's not really how sentences arrive, or the fact that I can be articulate with language. It's how meaning arrives, right? How do we form meaning? And so people talk about autism like bottom-up processing and whatnot. I think of it as whole to part. And I don't think that's a flavour of autism. I think that is Gestalt processing. I'll say that loud again, right? The parts don't lead. They follow. And so planning for me as a Gestalt processor begins at the ending oftentimes. Like, I know what the book looked like. I know what the series looked like. And then I have to dissect that 5-dimensional Gestalt that has been remembered forward into coherent pieces so that I can share them and speak about them and these kinds of things. And so when I talk to parents of Gestalt processing students about the typical supports that we write into support plans and stuff at school, if you're a Gestalt processor, the typical supports for note-taking and whatnot in classes, they don't work. They don't really work at all. And so oftentimes you'll see students shut down. Sometimes, people see me just kind of not doing anything and wonder, why am I not being productive? Why am I just sitting there or whatever? But for people like me, preparation happens mentally. It happens out of sight. It's mistaken for stillness in those who only measure movement, right? And so for me, my brain really, really rejects chronos, the chronological time, and really, really works in Kairos, kind of meaning time. And so for me, in Kairos, hyperfocus, that typical word that's used in autism discussions, doesn't feel like that at all. There's 2 clocks on the wall and sometimes 3 in meaning time. And that's something that I feel daily, that meaning time, not a loss of control, not that typical ADHD kind of trope of you've lost track of time, you have no executive function, which is where we are in the series, executive functioning, right? But it's another dimension entirely. It's that 5th dimension of meaning time where we don't really care what's going on, right? We have our own thing that we're doing, and it's meaningful to us. It might not be productive, it might not be profitable or whatever, but this meaning time is how I remember forward, right? How I can be here and something can arrive in my brain 100% complete, and then it's up to me in a panic and a rush to say, oh, I have to get to a keyboard, I have to write this out now. And so in that sense, the project can't feel complete, even before it's begun. And I describe it as, inarticulately as I do, as kind of remembering it instead of constructing it. And I know that confuses people, but I don't really have another way of explaining it. And so, they kind of sound mystical to people, like, how do they do this and stuff? But I think if your mind is trained in and works in Chronos entirely, you don't understand it, right? And to the Gestalt processor, when I say something like this, it's like, it's normal. Oh, yeah, great. And a lot of the comments I get from Substack are like, oh, yeah, finally I see something that describes me and I feel seen and I finally have the words for it. And, and I feel the same kind of gratitude backwards as well, because I did not have the words for this, right? I got them from Marge Blanc. I got them from Berry Present. I still struggle, sorry, Berry, with your name. Which, as an aside, I think, I have great difficulty with names. And until I hear somebody see it, in my mind, it kind of sounds a certain way. And then when I say, when I meet that person, or when I come across the actual pronunciation of their name, it takes a while to kind of remove that old scaffolding. So, Berry, I apologize. But back at it, there's a lot of activity on like Instagram and TikTok and such, the coach thing and the self-advocacy, where it's kind of circular. They feed each other, and they treat this Gestalt world as quirky autism, right? And it's something that you want to manage and be coached into a proper analytic order, and I completely reject that. And I think it's not to be a naysayer, but I think it sets people back. I don't want to say it's harmful necessarily, but it does set people back, because if they are a Gestalt processor, they need to know. They deserve to know. And they deserve to know that they're not disordered or defective or whatever, that they're probably perfectly normal Gestalt processor. And they need to find the community of people that can give them the scripts and the words that they need so that they can understand themselves better. And I think about myself when, I did not have the words for this. All I had was disorder. All I had was language support needs, level 2, etc. And I think about that part of my journey from the standpoint of DSM-4 to DSM-5, where it wasn't how I made meaning, it was how functional was I to industry, to capitalism, right? And so in that original diagnosis of, is it autism or is it Asperger's, right? And because I had scripts, because I was an adult, because I could answer questions, then I was under DSM-4 not disabled in language, right? Because I could say things, I could respond, even in a limited way. And so the other stuff became Asperger's, and it just sounds kind of odd to say that these days. But, and then all of my sensory integration and processing issues were their own diagnosis, right? And then DSM-5 comes around, everything gets collapsed into autism spectrum. And then the support needs levels thing gets added in. And all of a sudden, because I'm older now, and my language impairment, if you will, is more significant because I have a job that has high language needs. At this time, I'm already in forensic science. I'm already struggling with the language aspect of it, with the testimonial kind of extemporaneous stuff. I haven't been through occupational therapy yet for language support and so on. And so they saw that as more, from a functioning standpoint, you need that extra support. So that's the level 2. And it seems kind of funny because, it was this kind of exceptionality, almost kind of gifted scripting echolalia that kept me from the autism. this exceptionality said, well, no, it's just Asperger's. But then later on, the demand increases, and now I have these massive support needs. So it's not really indicative of my journey, but how the DSM evolves from kind of trying to accurately describe things to more, how do we make this person right for productivity? And so that's kind of where this has evolved, right? And I look at, my own journey in writing about kind of my autistic self and so on Substack, the outside. And I look back at some of the older stuff from 2022 or whatever, and think about, I'm not writing these things. I'm not a naysayer from the standpoint of I'm not writing from the outside of it. I'm not trying to create dogma or orthodoxy. I'm writing from within. I'm writing my own experience. And to that extent, other people are resonating and appreciating it, right? I'm trying to make something big and beautiful and, make it make sense to myself, and to my family and to friends and so on who don't quite understand what comes out of my head. And so from that standpoint, I've also tried to make these series very light, kind of less academic, and I don't know if it's my upbringing, I don't know if it's genetics or heritage or whatever, but I tend to think in poetry. I tend to think lyrically, and these pieces have been easier to get out as poems. And so I write the poem first, and then I kind of brain dump the poem as just a stream of consciousness, and it tends to make sense. And I've done it enough times now, so I'm kind of practiced in the form, but I'll write the poem first, and then I'll write the kind of explanation around that, and they kind of circle each other. But I am writing and speaking from inside this phenomenon of gestalt processing and autism, not as someone on the outside trying to correct and bring me into proper order. And I hope that makes sense. I hope that's clear. And the reason why I've kind of gone after, the naysayers and so on is because they are outsiders. They are not members of the community. And I think that's important, that you be not somebody's parent or sibling, but somebody themselves, right? And in my path to the classroom, I have, taken various cultural classes and, Chicano literature and, African-American literature, queer literature, etc. And from that standpoint, I am not myself Mexican-American, I'm not myself African-American. So I can come from the outside, I can appreciate, the form and the content and learn the histories and all that kind of stuff. But I cannot write from inside of it because that's not me. But in this sense, on the outside, I am writing from inside of it, and I am critiquing from inside of it. And I think that's why sometimes naysayers feel the sharpness of it. And so that is kind of an explanation of where we are. The unmasking part I thought was very important because, not just from the standpoint of being queer or trans, autistic, when you've grown up with other people's labels, when you grow up with other people's ideas imposed upon you as a child, you go out into the world and you see that certain things are not marketable. Certain employers do not want certain aspects of your identity, of your being. And so you learn to mask them, and if you're listening to this and you don't know what I mean, imagine that you are heavily tattooed and you have tattoos all over your, all the way down to your wrists and whatever. And your employer says, well, you may not wear short sleeve tunic. You must wear a long sleeve to cover because our grooming standards are such that, we don't want visible tattoos. So your long tunic is a mask. They might say, oh, we don't like piercings and whatnot, so you must take those out. But if that is something that really brings you joy and happiness, then having to take those out so that you can earn your living and make your money is a form of masking. And autistic people, gestalt processors, must do the same thing too. We must learn to kind of modify our stims, right? To not be visibly autistic. When we get overwhelmed, and I still do, we must not make a fuss. We must not make a scene. And so when I have since had the kind of economic and professional security and safety to unmask in all aspects of my life and live an integrated reality professionally, it's been amazing. It has been amazing, but it's been a journey, and it's taken 55 years for that to happen. And so from that standpoint, I realize, the precarity that we autistics live under. We're disposable in that sense to modern capitalist systems. And so it wasn't until I had my lifetime teaching credential, it was not until I had my tenure that I had a bit of safety to be myself. And I don't say that lightly. I know autistic people in my district who are not doing so well because they're under a regime at their school where they're not liked. And I've experienced that myself, the professional bullying that goes on and so on. And so, yes, I masked. Yes, I did my best. Yes, I hid all aspects of myself because after this many decades of supporting myself and so on, I understood how to mask, how to be effective. And yes, being as tall as I am and, light-skinned and light-eyed and all that kind of stuff and the kind of quirks of my accent and whatnot, understood how to play it, I guess. But it has a cost, right? We operate beyond burnout on a daily basis in America, those of us that have jobs, and very few do, sadly. But I understand this. And so I wanted to write the unmasking piece from the standpoint of safety, right? That, okay, you have the name now. What are you going to do with it? And so we kind of walked through that whole series, and then we have to kind of clear everything out, right? What would safety mean, right? Once we deal with the masking, what does safety mean? What does that lack of obligation anymore to moderate ourselves? What does that mean? What does it mean to kind of pause things that we are not really interested in? Why would we put the mask back on after unmasking, after naming these things, autism, gestalt processing, etc. Right? Why would we do that? And so, what does it mean to live as our authentic selves? That field first way of being, right? And then with all of that done, I thought it would be a bit cheeky to say, we meet our final boss, right? The naysayers. And so we went back over that paper, the Naysayer Chronicles piece. And I thought it would be fun to drop a picture of Bricktop in the middle of that from the movie Snatch. And I know all of my gestalt processing friends who know that movie, know Guy Ritchie films, right? In their mind, when they see that scene, they can hear the dialogue, they can, recite that little bit of monologue there from Bricktop in his kind of very evil voice. And so I wanted to present his image as kind of the naysayer stand-in, the proxy there, but when you are out, when you're safe, when you're feeling, secure in things, then you read those articles from the naysayers. You read those papers and you think, what absolute silliness, right? I don't know what they're on about. And what you realize is they're writing from the outside of the experience, and they have an agenda, obviously. They're trying to enclose a space, obviously. But I don't think it hits the same anymore when you're kind of unmasked. And so from that standpoint, it's like, okay, you're unmasked, you're living field free. Now let's talk about the other kind of elephant in the room, the executive functioning thing, and how that's portrayed. Many of us autistic people also experience ADHD, myself included. And so what does that mean? Because we're always being, we're always being criticized for our executive functioning deficits. And so for this series, the current one now, I'm really leaning into the difference between chronos and kairos, to make sure that people really have kind of a firm language foundation around what I'm on about there. But I wanted definitely to move through that whole executive functioning piece, again, from the inside, not from, someone trying to invent a drug or a new day planner or whatever. But I wanted to speak kind of specifically because it's something I feel every day as a teacher in classroom. There's a violence to schedule. There's a violence to timers. There is a lack of relativity, a lack of connection, right? And it's like you go to your therapist and you've had a bad 2 weeks like I have or whatever, and you're sitting down and you might have 3 hours worth of stuff that you need to process, right? That you've assembled all the scripts and gestalts and feelings and everything, and you've prepared yourself, and you realize that it's maybe 3 hours worth of stuff there. I'm sorry, madam therapist, but here we go. And her response is, well, we've got 45 minutes, make it good. And then what do you do? Right? And that's what I mean about kind of the violence of the timer. It takes as long as it takes, right? And when it comes to these systems and these schedules and stuff, it doesn't work. And so that's why I think co-regulation and having your bestie and all of these kinds of things are very, very helpful. And so, from that standpoint, I'm moving on in this current week, coming up, tools that work. Right. And how we can redo schools and how we can redo employment and offering kind of suggestions. And then at the end of that, come to a different definition of executive functioning, but again, from within inside. So I know that's a lot. That's a mega monologue, I think. But I am kind of reading here from my big screen and my notes and stuff and trying to keep myself on track. But unlike days where Kathy is here keeping me policed under the timer, I've just kind of let myself ramble here. It is morning, it's early morning for me, and when Kathy and I get together, it's her evening and my morning. She's in Gloucestershire and I'm in California. So here we are at the end of it. But I guess as a final piece, as we get towards the half hour, I want to say thank you. Thank you for support. Thank you, not just like and subscribe and all that stuff, but thank you for reading. I hope that the pieces that I write across both of the Substacks are meaningful to you, that they bring value to your life. And obviously I appreciate dearly paid subscriptions and so on. I understand that, like myself, there are times when you can afford it. And so understanding that I keep the thing wide open. I don't put paywalls up, and I don't do kind of heavy pitches on the middle and stuff, and when I do an appeal, it's kind of a dedicated one usually. So from that standpoint, I do want to say thank you. Thank you if you're sharing this in group spaces, Facebook groups or whatever, for getting the word out in your practices. I know a lot of language therapists, language pathologists kind of share my work around, and I'm happy that they do. And I think, again, thank you from the bottom of my heart that you write comments on how this has touched you, impacted you, whatever. I love to read those. I find them very inspirational because I think contrary to what people tend to think when they see long-form articles and poetry and all this kind of stuff, I'm actually a very shy person, right? I have not put myself out there, the logo is the logo, it doesn't have my face on it. I'm very bashful about appearances and stuff, and a lot of that has to do with the kind of merciless bullying I had as a child and just trying to fade into backgrounds and stuff, and first careers just being background and so on. Not trying to be noticed and these kinds of things. So I'm still figuring all of this stuff out, all the social media and stuff, and the bullying that goes along in queer life and in trans life about what proper appearance is and stuff. And so getting used to this video format and stuff has been an interesting thing. But I'm having a bit of fun with it now, I think, and I'm feeling a bit more comfortable. And that's thanks to you, because you've left nice comments and have been, not overly complimentary, but not kind of sugary, the comments have been sincere, I guess. And as I struggle now to keep it together, language-wise, on this kind of long monologue, again, just thank you. And I look forward to speaking with you next week. Bye-bye.